As we start chapter 2, it's important again to try to lay the groundwork of what exactly it is that we're trying to do in this chapter. So you might recall that in chapter 1, our goal was to try to get a basic understanding of what exactly the world of three dimensions was and how some really basic algebra sorts of things were done in that new world. So we did things like plotting points and calculating distances. We worked a lot with vectors to help us navigate through the space, and we did some basic sorts of graphs like lines and planes. Well, when we get into chapter 2 here, what we're going to be kind of focusing on is extending a little bit more on what we saw with lines. We know that from algebra class, lines were just one of many possible functions that we could have graphed in two-space. But we also know that there were lots of other curves that became very important and common to try and study. We dealt with things like quadratics and trig functions and logarithms and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So we're familiar with curves as they exist in two-space and a lot of different variations of these curves. We're going to try to create here in chapter 2 some curves that can help us navigate throughout three-space. And this leads us here to our first section and our first definition. Chapter 2 is going to be all about this concept of what we call vector-valued functions, or more briefly, vector functions. Okay. So what is a vector function? Let's see what this says here. A vector function is simply a function whose domain, okay, so the inputs, is some subset of the real numbers. Okay, so we're going to put real numbers in to this sort of function, and then the range, the outputs of this function are going to be vectors. Okay. So we're going to be studying functions like that in this section where we input a number into a function and it spits back a vector. We kind of can talk about how we would represent what this function does in inputs and outputs by using notation like you see down here. You'll see that R is listed here as the name of the function that I'm working with. This R here represents the real numbers and represents where the values of the domain come from. And over here we have Rn, again meaning that I'm talking about vectors, like groups of different input values, I guess, or output values, if you will, right? We know that vectors can come in 2 components or 3 components or maybe even more. So specifically in our class, we're going to be dealing with functions like R that have real number inputs, but typically are going to be spitting out vectors with 3 components. Throughout this section, we're going to take a quick brief look at these sorts of functions and understand, again, some very kind of basic algebra style things, like how do we understand domains of these functions, how do we understand what these functions loosely look like, and can we interpret kind of a function formula from its graph and vice versa.